Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we're creating a calendar inside of our Django and React application. This is already the third video in this series. In previous videos we've already focused on an introduction and the basic setup of FullCalendar because that's the way that we've implemented the calendar in our application. And we've also taken a look at FullCalendar views. And in there we've taken a look at the different ways that we can present the calendar for the user and how we can add buttons so that the user can switch between different views. In this video, we're going to continue and we're going to display data from our SQLite database of our Django application on our FullCalendar in our React JS frontend. And in the end, that will look something like this. Now, to do that, we are going to go through a process fully from the backend to the frontend by following 7 main steps. We're going to start with a few backend installs that we need to do to make sure that we can get the data from the backend to the frontend. We're then going to be creating a database model that is going to store our data, and we're going to be manually adding some data to that model. Then we're going to enable our backend to send data to the frontend by creating a URL, a serializer, and a view. And then on the front end, we're going to also do some installs and make sure that we can retrieve that backend data by using Axios. Then once we have that data, we're going to be passing it to our FullCalendar and see if everything works the way that we expect. Now this overview briefly touches upon how this whole process is going to work. In the end, we will have a SQLite database that has a schema based on the definitions in our models.py file. And in there, we will have some data that we want to get to the front end. We can then write a view, a serializer, and a URL to make sure that the data can go to the front end. The URL will define in which URL we can find the data. The serializer will make sure that the data format from our backend is translated to JSON, so our frontend can actually use it. And our views.py file brings everything together and tells us which URL and serializer is connecting all of the stuff from our backend to our frontend. Then once the serializer has passed the data to our frontend in the JSON format, we use Axios to actually get it. And from there, we can pass it to our calendar. And that is the full process of how we're going to do this. Now, similarly to the last video, I copied over all of the files from the previous tutorials, which was stored in the files for calendar 2, and I have pasted them and made sure that they're available in calendar 3 so that we can start off fresh. And if we take a look at our front end, you can also see that right here because we're now going to be working on the calendar 3. Now, the first thing that we need to do is install some packages inside of our backend. And the first package that we will need is Django REST Framework. And this is basically a tool for writing APIs, which is basically about sending data to the front end and the other way around. Now, installing Django REST Framework is very easy. We need to use pip install Django REST Framework. So we're going to go over to our code and to our backend. And I've already made sure that we are in the right backend folder and that our virtual environment is activated. And we're going to do python/m and then pip install Django REST Framework. And this is going to make the install so that we have it ready for our project. Now, as the documentation also mentions, we also need to add it to our installed apps. So I'm going to copy over REST_framework. We're going to go to our code and to our backend folder and then to API. And in our settings.py file on the top in the installed app section, I'm going to add REST framework to the list of the installed apps. Now, the next package that we also will need is Django course headers. And Django course headers means cross-origin resource sharing. And it basically means that we make sure that our front end has the ability to make the connection to our backend. It is going to tell us what sources are allowed to make requests and which ones are not. So same goes here. We can install this with python-m and then pip install Django course headers. So we're going to go back to our code and also complete that install right there. And then similarly as before, we can also copy over the course headers for installed apps. And we can go to our settings again in the API, and underneath the REST framework, we can also put the course headers. Now there's one more thing that we also need to add, which is a line right here that we need to take to our middle,ware, which is course headers.middleware.course middleware. And it's very important that you place that above the security one. So we're going to go to our middleware, and I'm just on the top line, I'm going to put course headers.middleware.course middleware. And that should make sure that our frontend can now communicate to our backend. And for the people that have not done this yet, please also make sure that you list down your front-end URL inside of the course allowed origins. This was something that was already inside of my application when I started this series, but make sure to also add this so that everything will work the way that you expect. The next step is actually creating a model or a table in our database where we can store the data that we want to display on our calendar. And to do that, I'm going to go to the My Calendar folder in my application, and I'm going to go to the models.py file, because in here we can create our new model. So how do we do that? I'm going to start by defining a class, and I'm going to call that appointments, because that is what it's going to be. Then I say that this is a models.model, like this, and then we do some colon right there. And now underneath here, we can define all of the different fields that we would like to have in our model. Now, the first thing what I want is that our appointments have a name. And this name is going to be a models.car field, which basically means that it's going to be accepting strings. And in there, we will state that the max length of the appointment name can be 200 characters. Next, we also want this appointment to have a start date. And in there we can define that it is a models.date field. And I'm actually going to copy over this line completely and paste it because we also want to enable an end date right here. And this is going to also be a models.date field. Now I'm also going to allow some comments. So in there, I again copy over the models.car field. But now I'm going to say that the max length is going to be equal to 500. And we will also say that blank is equal to true. And also null is equal to true, just to make sure. Which means that this is not going to be a required field. Next to that, we can also have a status inside of our appointments. Now, I'm just going to copy over this one from the name. But the status can be a maximum of 100 characters. Now, ideally, you would let this be some kind of a foreign key field with a few options you can pick from. But for this example, I'm just going to leave it as a character field. As the last two things, I'm going to also create a created field, which is going to tell when a record is created. And we can do models.datetime field like this. And then we can define auto_now add is equal to true, which basically means that once it is created, it will automatically take the timestamp from the day. We can also do a modified date, which is going to be exactly the same thing as the created date, but now instead of auto now add, we just do auto now. And this means that every time a change is being made, it's taking a look at what time it is now and adding that to our database. Now, the last thing that we are going to put underneath here is define how we should refer to these appointments. And to do that, I can do def and then 2 underscores and then str and then again 2 underscores. And then we can do self. And now I can do return self.name. And this means that when we look in our admin portal later on, it will display the name of our appointments inside of the database. Which is a little bit more convenient than showing the IDs. So that's what this is for. We've now defined the table in our database, but nothing has really changed because this still hasn't made any change. So to make sure that it takes effect, we need to migrate our database. So we can do python manage.py and then make migrations. And it has now created the model for appointments. And then we can do python manage.py migrate. And this will make sure that it's actually applied to our database. Okay, so we've now created our appointments model, but we don't actually have a place where we can see it or where we can add records. A tool that we can use to actually do that is the admin portal from Django. But to make sure that this appointments model is visible, we need to register. So we're going to go to the admin.py file, and in there we're first going to do from.models, and we're going to just import all. And now we can register our appointments model by doing admin.site.register, and then put in the appointments model. And this is going to make sure that it's visible in the admin portal of Django. Now, to go to the admin portal of Django, we also need to have some user credentials, but we can very easily get those by doing a command in our terminal. And that is python manage.py and then create super user. And in there it's going to ask us a few questions. First off, the username, and I'm going to pick user1. The email address, I'm just going to do user1@email.com. And our password can be testing321. And again, testing321. All right, our user is now created successfully. So let's now start our server by doing python manage.py run server. And let's see what we see in the admin portal. And we have now started our server, and you can see that everything has worked successfully. And we can go to our admin portal by doing /admin. And now we can use our credentials to log in to this admin portal. So we can do user1, and then as the password, it was testing321. And now inside of this Django admin portal, you can see our models for appointments. And this actually will provide us with the options to also add records. So let's add a few records that we can then later on hopefully see in our calendar. So I'm going to start by creating an appointment with the name of appointment 1. And I'm also just going to copy this over for later. And we will say that it has a start date of the 2nd of April and an end date of the 4th of April. And in the status, I'm going to say open. Then we're going to save and do another one. And we can do appointment number 2 with a start date from the 22nd of April, maybe until the 23rd. And this one, we're going to say it's in progress. And now let's also add appointment number 3 and do the start date of somewhere in May, let's say May the 6th until May the 11th. Oh, actually need to select May the 11th like this. And we can also say that this one is also open, and we can even save and add another for appointment number 4. And in there we say that it's also happening in May and going to be the 27th until the 30th of May. And we can say that this one is completed somehow. And let's save it. And now you can see that we have 4 records inside of our database. And now we just need to make sure that this data is going to be available for our front end. And we can do just that by creating a serializer, a URL, and a view. The first thing that we're going to create is our serializer. And this is going to make sure that the data from our SQLite database can be read by our front end. Because the way that our SQLite database likes to receive the data is a little bit different than the front end. So we need to make sure that it's available in JSON for the front end. So inside of my calendar, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call this serializers.py. And we start on top of this file with a few imports. So we do from rest_framework, and then we import serializers. And we're going to do from.models, import, and then all. And now we can simply create our serializer by doing class and then give it a name. And I'm going to call it appointment serializer. And then in there we define serializers.model serializer. And then we can do a colon, and underneath here define what we actually want to see. So in there we can state class meta, and inside of this meta we need to define a few things. The first thing for our serializer what we need to define is the model that the data is going to be coming from, and in this case that is going to be from our appointments model, because that's the data that we want to bring to the front end. The other thing that we also need to specify are the fields that we want to bring to the front end. And in this instance, if we go to our models.py file, we have a name, a start date and end date. We have comments and status, and also we have created and modified. Now, in this first example, I'm only going to bring the name, the start date, and the end date to our front end. And we're also going to bring the ID. The rest of the fields we don't really need at this point, so we don't need to include them. So inside of this fields parameter, I'm going to put in ID. I'm going to put in the start date. We're going to also then put in the end date. And as a last one, we can also put in the name. And let's save this. So now we have defined the mechanism that is going to change the format of the data so it's readable for our front end, but we still need to define exactly what needs to happen. And to tell our application that, we can write a view, because that's actually going to define what we want to see. So we're going to go to our views.py file, and in here we're going to make some imports. So I'm just going to delete it from the top. I'm going to do from rest underscore framework, and I'm going to import view sets, and I'm also going to import permissions. Next, I'm going to do from.serializers, which is the file that we have just created, and I'm going to import all. We're also going to do from rest underscore framework, and then .response. And from there, we're going to import response. And as a last one, we're also going to do from.models, and we're again going to import all. Now in our view, we can define everything about our data and how we need to bring it to the front end. And in this instance, we are going to create a view set instead of a traditional view. And I've also done this in previous tutorials, and defining a view set makes it really easy to have one view for listing out all of your items, but then also for creating and updating items. So we're going to create our view set by doing class, and then we can give it the name of appointment view set. And inside of there, we can say viewsets.viewset. And be sure that you also have the capitals right. Now on the top of our view set, we need to define a few things. And the first things that we need to define are the permission classes. And this is going to tell us a little bit about who should be able to make calls to this data. In this case, we're going to do permissions.allow any, because in my example, anyone has the ability to view this data. But if your application is actually secure and has a login mechanism, you can pick many other options as well. For example, is authenticated or read only, or is admin use. So there are quite a few things that you can do to restrict access to data. But in our case, we're just going to do allow any, because this is just a proof of concept. The next thing that we need to define is the query set that is going to be important for this view set. And we just already created it. It's the appointments model. And then we're going to do .objects.all. And the last thing that our view set also wants to know is how are we going to serialize this data. And to define that, we can do serializer underscore class. And we can specify right here that we want to use our appointment serializer that we've just created in our .serializers file. Now, underneath this basic information, you can define all of the things that you need for creating data, for updating data. But in our case, we just want to pass a list of all of our data to the front end. And we can simply define that by doing def list. And this takes in two parameters, which is self and also request. And in here, we need to define again what our query set is going to be. It is going to be exactly the same as on the top here. It's going to be appointments.objects.all. Then we can say for the serializer that we want to do self.serializer class. And we then need to define what we need to put inside of our serializer. So what is the information that we want to serialize and bring to the front end? Well, in our case, that is going to be equal to the query set. And we also say that many is equal to true, because we can have multiple records here. Now the last thing what we also need to tell this list is what are we actually going to do with it? Well, we're going to return a response. And that response is going to contain serializer.data. Because what we want to bring to the front end is the actual data from our model, which is serialized so that we can actually use it. So let's save this. Okay, so we've now defined the data that we want to bring to our front end. We have told our view that we also need to serialize it, but the last thing that we also need to define is where we can actually find this data, because we don't have a URL yet. So inside of my calendar, I'm going to create a new file again, which is going to be called urls.py. And in here, we're going to do a few imports. So we're going to do from Django.urls, we're going to import path. And then we're going to do from.views, and we are going to import everything because we want to say which view belongs to our URL. And then we're also going to do from rest_framework.routers, and then we're going to import the default router. And the reason that we import this is that we're going to follow a little bit of a different approach of registering our URLs. Usually what you would do is you would define it like this, have all of the different paths below each other. But if we use a router, it actually is going to define all of the URLs, not only for listing information down, but also for creating and editing it. So you don't need to specify them separately. But it actually works exactly the same. So if you want to follow the other approach, that is completely fine. So we start by defining our router, which is going to be equal to that default router. Then we're going to do router.register. And the first thing that we need to list here is what the endpoint of our data is going to be. And in this case, the extension of that is going to be appointments, because that's where we want to find the data. Next, we are going to define which view set is going to make sure that data is going to get there. And that is going to be our appointment view set. And as the last parameter, we are going to define the base name. And that is going to be equal to appointments. Now, the only thing that we need to do as well is define our URL patterns. And that is going to be equal to not a list, but to router.urls. And if you don't use this approach right here, you can just use the same approach as in the basics. You can just define your URL patterns like you are used to. Okay, so our URL is now defined. Only thing that we also need to do is include it inside of the main URLs file that we have in our other folder. So we're going to go to API and then urls.py, and I just need to import include. And now I can include the URLs from my other folder inside of here so that it all lands in our application. So we're going to do path, and I'm going to specify just an empty string because I don't want to have any prefix. And in there I say include all of the URLs from our my calendar.urls file. And this is just going to bring everything that we've just defined into this so that it's all available in our backend. And I actually made a small mistake in the urls.py file of my calendar. After the default router, we need to have two of these round brackets like this. So let's now save it. So now let's take a look when we go to our backend URL on what we see. And we're now inside of our API root, or just the address of our backend server. And you can see that now appointments has been registered as one of our view sets. And if we go to the appointments, you can actually see that we now have the data in here. So that works very nice. Now, one thing that you will notice is that the format that the data is currently in will not fit our calendar. Because right now we have start_date, end_date, and we have name. But if we go to our code and we go to our front end and the actual calendar that we created in the previous video, you can see that currently it expects the data to have the prefix of title and then also start and end. So not the names that we have defined right now. And we can do all different kinds of fancy things in our front end to make sure that it will follow these conventions, or even loop over it and have a different column name and make sure that it fits like that. But we can actually make a very simple change in our serializer to make sure that the column names that FullCalendar expects align with what we bring to the front end. So we're going to go back to our serializer right now. And in there is actually very easy to change the way that the columns are being displayed. What we can do on top of the class method is we can define the fields that we want to have. So for example, I can define title, and we can say that title is going to be equal to serializers.car field, because it is a character field. And then next we can define that the source is going to be equal to the field called name. And the reason for that is that it's going to be called name in my database, but on the front end we want to see title in the end. Now we can do exactly the same for start. And there we define that as serializers, but this time dot date field, because we want to see a date. And now we can say that the source is going to be equal to the start date. And we can actually copy this over and do the same for the end date, where we're going to call it end, because that's what we expect in the front end. And then the source is going to be end underscore date. Now the last thing that we now need to do is we need to change these fields names right here so that they match with what we have defined. So we want to see the ID, start, end, and then title. And this should make sure that we now see the correct names in the API. And we can actually test that inside of our API route, because if I now click on the appointments, you will see that the column names have changed and they now reflect start, end, and title. So this makes sure that it will actually fit our FullCalendar perfectly. And this actually marks the end of all of the stuff that we needed to do for our backend, because the data is now ready to be pulled to the front end and actually being displayed on our calendar. Now the first thing what we actually need to do is we need to make a request to this URL to actually get this data in our front end and start using it. And a popular way to do that is by using Axios, because Axios makes sure that integrations are actually quite easy. Now, of course, the first thing that we need to do is install Axios. So we're going to copy over npm I Axios. We're going to go over to our code to the front end, and I'm going to just move out and install Axios into our project. And the install is now complete. Now the next thing what we need to do, we need to configure and construct a way that we can use Axios to actually get the data from the link in the URLs in our backend. And to do that, we're going to create a new file in which we're going to construct that request. So inside of components, I'm going to create a new file, and that file is going to be called Axios instance with the extension of .jsx. Now, what we're going to do in here is we're going to create a reusable piece of code that we can use to get data from our backend, but also the other way around, so that we can send data from our front end to our backend. And I've also done this in previous videos in a little bit more detail. Now, to do this, we're going to start by importing Axios from Axios. And now we're going to create a constant. And this constant is going to be called Axios instance. And we're going to say that that constant is going to be equal to axios.create. And then we're going to do some round brackets and some squarely brackets. Now, inside of here, we need to define a few things. The first thing we want to define is the base URL that Axios needs to look for. And the base URL is actually nothing else than the backend URL, except for the extension. Now, you all can already see in our backend, which is running in the terminal, that the base URL is this string right here. It is the localhost 8000. So what I'm going to do is on the top here, I'm going to define a constant, and I'm going to call it my base URL. And I'm going to set that equal to the URL that we have right here. And now on the bottom right here, I can say that base URL is going to be equal to my base URL. Now the next thing we're going to write is a timeout, and that makes sure that the request is not executed immediately, but that there's a little bit of latency for stuff to load. After that, we're going to define headers, and headers is some piece of information that our request needs to understand what it is actually about. The first thing that we're going to define in our headers is a content type, and in this content type we specify that it's about application/JSON. And the next thing that we're going to define is accept. And in there, we're going to put in the exact same thing because it's again going to be application/JSON. And just like this, we have created a reusable piece of code that we can use to get our data from the backend. And I'm going to show you in a minute how we can actually fetch the data after this. Now, the last thing that we need to do is export this constant so that we can use it in another file. So in here, I say export default Axios instance, and this is going to make sure that I can use this in different files. So let's save this right here, and now we should be able to use it. So let's see if we can actually fetch the data from our backend, and I'm going to do that in my calendar3.jsx page, and this is just a copy from our previous video. The first thing that we need to change is some of the imports. In here we have an import of React, but we also want to use effect, which is going to help us with identifying how often we want to recall the API. And I also want to import useState. Next, we also want to import the Axios instance that we have just created so we can actually make the call of the API. Now, the first thing that I will define on the top is a constant, and that constant is going to be equal to events and then comma set events, and we're going to say that that is going to be equal to useState. The next thing that we're going to define is a constant called getData, and as the name shows you, it's actually going to get our data. So we're going to do an is sign and then some round brackets, and after that we're going to do an arrow function and some squarely brackets. And in here we're going to be using our Axios instance function to get the data. So we're going to do Axios instance and then do .get. And this function will now expect us to provide the URL endpoint that we actually want to get. Because in the Axios instance, we've already defined the base URL like this, but now we need to also provide the URL that we have defined in our router, which is /appointments. So in this round brackets right here, we're going to do some backwards commas, and then we say appointments, and we're going to finish with a trailing slash because that is quite important. Now we have received the data, but we actually need to do something with this information because we cannot use it like this. So we're going to then type .then because we want to do something after it. And then I'm going to start with opening some round brackets and then some round brackets again. And in this one, we're going to put res, which is what we're going to call our result of the thing that is happening right here. And then after res, we do another arrow function and some squarely brackets like this. And in there, we're going to say that we want to use set events right here. And what we want to do is we want to set events to res.data. And what this actually does, it is going to make sure that the variable called events is going to contain the data that we fetch from Axios instance, which we pass to events through the set events. Now, I also want to make sure that this works in a minute and check it in a console. So I'm also going to do console.log. And in there, I say res.data. So this should also put the data in my console. Now we have defined the function of getData, but there's actually nothing that triggers it right now. And we can trigger this request by putting it in a useEffect hook, because useEffect basically determines how often we're going to get some data. After the constant, I'm going to do useEffect, and then we do 2 times the round brackets. And after the first complete set of round brackets, we do an arrow function. And after that arrow function, we of course need the squarely brackets again, like this. And in there, we say that we want to do get data because we actually want to get the data. And we do a colon right there. Now, this does not define when we want to get the data, and we're going to, after the last squarely bracket, do a comma and then do an empty list, because this is going to tell it that we only want to get the data the first time that we get to our calendar page, and we don't want to have the request being done afterwards. So now I'm going to save this right here. And when we now go to our front end and start the server, we should be able to see the data in the console. So we're going to go to our terminal and do npm run dev. And let's see what we see. So the server has started. And when we now go to the calendar free page right here, and we do right click and we then do inspect, we should be able to see our data in the console. And you can see right here that we indeed have the array inside of our console, including the start, the end, and the title. And the last thing that we now need to do is actually pass this data into our calendar. And to realize that, we're going to make a small change to the underlying code of the calendar. So we're going to go to my calendar 3, because we've also copied over my calendar 2 from the previous video. And in here, we're going to replace the events that we have defined manually. And we're going to change this and set this to my events. And this is going to be a prop that we can use to pass our data to the calendar. So we're going to also copy over my events and do some squarely brackets in the top here of my calendar, and then put in my events, so that we now know that my calendar 3 will expect my events to be populated in order for it to show anything. So we're going to save this, and now we're going to go back to calendar 3. And now we can add the prop of my events into calendar and define that my events is going to be equal to, then do some squarely brackets and set that to events. And now let's save that. And how that actually works is that the use effect is going to triggering the get data. The get data is going to get the data and then use set events to populate events with our data, and those are then being passed to our calendar. So let's now see the end result in the browser. And I actually made a small typo on the top here, because it's actually my calendar 3 from my calendar 3 and not from my calendar 2. So let's now check if we see the database data in our front end. Okay, and we're now in our front end, and you can indeed see that the appointments that we have created in our backend are now visible on our calendar. So we have an appointment from the 2nd to the 3rd of April. We have an appointment on the 22nd of April and a very long appointment down here in May. And if we go even further, we can also see the other appointments right here. So this is working just fine. And you can also see in our backend right here that it actually matches the contents of our database. So this is working exactly the way that we would like. And that is actually all for this video. In this video, I showed you the full process of getting data from your Django backend into the full calendar on the React JS frontend. In the next video, we're going to continue, and I'm going to show you how you can make sure that your appointments have different colors based on a label inside of your data. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.